Welcome everybody. I'm happy to see so many people here for the first research seminar at the Institute for this spring. And I'm even more happy to see Lea Ypi here. Actually for the third time I realize now, but that's over a span of 9 years. That is. And Lea is Professor of Political Theory at London School of Economics and has done a lot of research in normative political theory, democratic theories, issues of migration, enlightenment, political thought, Kant, Marxism, critical theory, and national in the intellectual history of the Balkans, especially Albania, and have written several very good books on this. But she has also written a book that became a rather smashing success, Free, and this book which described growing up in Albania. And this seminar will also be a little bit different in this way, because Lea is going to read a piece from her forthcoming book, but it's not actually finished, so we're going to be one of the first to hear about this. And then we will have a discussion about this project that will raise issues in philosophy and politics, I would guess. So Lea, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be back here. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some themes from my next book, which is a hybrid, again, like Free, of philosophy, history, and literature. And the themes of which are historical injustice, reconciliation, the relationship between fact and fiction, and the role of art in thinking about truth. So these are the kinds of philosophical topics. There is a famous Schiller poem which gave the title to this talk, which is The Gods of Greece. And it has this line that starts by saying, "Beautiful world, where are you?" Now, a lot of people know that line more from the latest Sally Rooney novel than from the Schiller poem from which it came from. But the themes of that poem are actually the ones that I also want to address in this lecture, and indeed that are at the center of my book, which is exactly, as I said, the relationship between morality, human nature, historical injustice, and then these questions at the interplay of art and philosophy. Schiller's poem was written in the aftermath of the French Revolution of 1789. This book is in the aftermath, in a way, of the Revolution of 1989, so 200 years after. And both of these revolutions promised freedom and the opening of this new era for justice, for humanity. Both were marked by division and by the divisive legacy of the past. And in many ways, both were surrounded by this hope for unity and for overcoming of divisions and polarization after this dystopian moment. And in many ways, I think we can now also say with some distance from 1989, both of them failed because they didn't bring this unity. Instead of building humanity, as they were hoping to do, they ended up destroying confidence in it. And we can see that because of the political moment in which we live right now. And instead of inspiring trust in society, they ended up actually resulting in the worst excesses of individualism and undermining this sense of collective unity that inspired these revolutions. So our world, I think, is marked as much by disenchantment and polarization and division and the loss of faith in humanity as the world that Schiller was writing about and was trying to depict, and the kind of feeling of longing that he was describing was, to some extent, I think, similar. But there is one difference in that world, in the world of Schiller, and in the words of the poets and the philosophers of this post-Enlightenment idealist movement. There was a kind of hope that art or philosophy would somehow think or help us think about reconciliation, if not hope in the real, at least in the imagined, in the kind of projected world. So the question is, what is it that can give us hope now? Because I think in some ways we're even worse than the historical and philosophical moment in which these projects were emerging is even worse. There was some hope then in this redeeming faith of art and in the capacity of art to mediate between instincts and feelings and the conflicts of the real political world and moral imperatives to some extent, whereas we have even lost the capacity to think about moral imperatives and to also think about how to bring this unity. And so there isn't even the hope in the imagined as there was back then. And for Schiller in his poem, you know, he says at some point he has this line where he says the gods that are in exile from the political world of this revolutionary aftermath live in the imagination of poets. And the question is, where do the gods in exile now live? And where do we find reconciliation in the contemporary world? So these are the kind of the broad themes of both the lecture and the book, and I'm going to talk about some of them today by taking you on this journey, which will start with a reading from the project, away from this post-French revolutionary world of 1789, and also away from this utopia of classical Greek unity that Schiller describes, into the dystopia of my current book project, which is a redescription and a reimagining of the life of a woman, my grandmother. Her name was Leman Ypi. She was born Leskovikou, and she was born in Saloniki, old Salonika, in Greece in 1918, a few years before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. She died in Tirana in Albania in 2005, just after a decade after the collapse of communism. So her life spans from collapse of the Ottoman Empire to the collapse of communism. As you can see, covers a lot of ground, basically the whole history of the 20th century. And so I'm going to start just to give you a flavor of the voice of the book and of the project by reading some pages from one of the kind of key passages in the book, just so you see where it's going methodologically. And then I'll say a little bit about the main philosophical theme that animates the book and the project and how I'm thinking about going about. It's a book that in some ways is difficult to discuss philosophically because it works as a novel, as a literary project, so it's more show, don't tell. But what I'm trying to do today is to kind of step back a little bit from that and give you a sense of the philosophical project behind it. And in many ways, as I said, methodologically, it's connected to Free because it's the same effort to think about philosophy and history through literature. It's also connected because, again, in many ways, it's like a prequel to Free. My grandmother is a character in Free, which is an autobiographical book. This one is not. It is autobiographical in pieces, but it's mainly about her life. And as I say, it's connected by this central character. And then I want to, at the very end, reflect a little bit about what I started with, which is the relevance of Schiller's poem and project, and this idea of how we think about the unity between art and philosophy at the end of the lecture. So this now goes a reading, so bear with me for about 15-20 minutes while I take you on this journey. And then I'll tell you when it's the end of the reading, and then I'll start thinking about the project. Okay, start of the reading. I'm looking for the authority for information concerning documentation of the former State Security Service, I say, placing myself in front of a first taxi parked on Comune Parisit, one of the newish busy roads lined up with shops and cafes that connect the center of Tirana to the outer ring of the city. I hesitate to call it my road, even though my family lives there, and it has been my official home address for at least 15 years. Already when we moved to Tirana, the question, or rather remark, "You're not from here, right?" came up with nagging regularity every time I started one of those casual conversations with strangers that seemed as harmless in the way they started as they risked turning awkward the longer they lasted. Already then, I resented the unspoken hierarchy between those who acquired the "from here" title by birth and those who, betrayed by their accents, would have to justify their presence in the city. When my family moved to Tirana, around the time I left Albania to study in Italy, my father was unemployed. He joined the reserve army of those who hoped to find a job in a larger center, an illusion he shared with many, just as he shared the disillusionment that followed. I have no happy memories of the place. My only neutral associations to it are news items, communist-era films, and more recently traffic jams. The most extended stay I've had to endure in the city was when my father and grandmother died unexpectedly in quick succession and I was forced to return to make funeral arrangements and Turkish coffee. Locked up in the kitchen during the compulsory 40 days of mourning, I remember feeling a distinct sense of guilt that I had gone back when it was already too late. Too late twice. And perhaps to alleviate the guilt, I started blaming the city. Most people who return to Tirana tend to remark how much it has changed in the last few years. There are now more concrete buildings, paved roads, cafes, bars, and cycle paths. For me, it's a place of grief, guilt, and counterfactuals. When I visit, I get lost in the small alleyways that run through the city like so many misplaced veins. I'm barely able to orient myself even in the pretentiously named Paris Commune, the neighborhood that is supposed to be my own. Perhaps a part of me unconsciously wants to be lost, to remind myself that I never fully belonged. Or perhaps never knowing my way around is the best hope I have that one day I will learn. I'm looking for the Authority for Information Concerning Documentation of the former State Security Service. I repeat, surprising myself that for the second time I have introduced the office in the formal way it has introduced itself in the email inviting me to an appointment. The taxi driver does not hear me at first. A gray-haired man in his 70s with a hollowed-out face covered by thick, dark sunglasses. He wears a checked, short-sleeved shirt and a red "Make America Great Again" cap with the US flag printed on the side. There is loud music coming from his yellow Mercedes-Benz, a radio station called Top Gold that plays old classics. But as I stand in front of the taxi waiting for his reaction, I recognize the sound of the Platters, Only You, struggling to beat Lady Gaga's Just Dance emerging from the taxi lined up after his. He's not listening to the music. The station has clearly been chosen to attract a certain kind of customer. Instead, he smokes, entirely absorbed in a newspaper. I'm looking for the Authority for Information Concerning Documentation of the former State Security Service, I repeat impatiently. I must sound worried, or at least agitated, because the tone of my voice prompts the driver to finally detach his eyes from the newspaper, switch off the radio, toss the butt of the unfinished cigarette outside the car window, and turn towards me with an expression of concern. "Avash, Avash," he says. "Take it easy. Who's that you're looking for?" "Oh." I mutter something, confused by the fact that he has not recognized the official name of my destination. "I'm looking for the office with all the files, you know, the former Sigurimi archives." "You're not from here, right?" he asks, once the engines are on and we're making our way through the busy morning traffic. I smile, trying to conceal my irritation. "I wonder what gave that away." "You said you're going to the former Sigurimi archives. That's how foreigners talk. There are no formers here. It's all the same people. My kids, they live in Florida. They come once a year and they say it all looks different. Nonsense." "This has changed though, hasn't it?" I say, pointing at the line of cars stuck in front of the traffic before turning onto 4 Hero Street. "They can't drive them," he replies instantly, with the evident satisfaction of someone prepared to crush such a superficial objection. "Would be better if they didn't have them, wouldn't it?" "Other things have changed too," I say, more to see how he will handle the next objection. "Look at all those new trees planted." "Ah, you're just like my daughter," he exclaims. "She lives in Florida. She only comes for New Year's Eve and she falls in love with the lights on the trees. Have you seen what's going on here in the winter? There's so many lights you'd think there's a war. All because of the Christmas decorations. We're not even Christian. If you come at any other time, you'll see it for yourself. It's all the same. Nothing's changed. All the same people. Even the trees know it." I'm still thinking about the connection between trees, war, and Christmas decorations, since we are at the end of May. But he brakes the car suddenly and from the open window curses the other drivers trying to force a U-turn. We've just passed before Ethem Bey Mosque, curved left into George W. Street, and we're about to reach the Jeanne d'Arc Boulevard when he decides to change route. "I just remembered something," he explains. "You want to go to the new office, right? The one where they recently moved to." "Not sure," I say, pulling out my phone to double-check the address. "I have here Unit 4, Skanderbeg Military Garrison." I'm starting to find reassuring the formality of the email, as well as the fact that each time I look at it, the content hasn't changed. Come for an appointment on Tuesday, bring an ID, ensure the fee has been paid in advance. I particularly appreciate going over the names of family members, my father, my grandmother, my grandfather, the way the list of names is offered to me like some sort of meal deal, in a spirit of commercial detachment, which is just what I need at this stage. Nothing to feel emotional about, just the secret lives of a random group of people to whom I was assigned at birth, just like specific items of food are assigned a discount. Yes, yes, that's the one, he nods. They moved there recently. There was some grant from the Swedish embassy. It's true. Are you going there for work or for fun? To dig into my grandmother's past, I think. To talk to her. To finally bury her. To feel less guilty. To discover how those wartime photos of her, which we had thought were lost forever, appeared on a viral Facebook post. To find the truth. To see if my father was a spy. To write a book. To bury him. To bury her. To see if it's all history or if it's not history yet. Maybe I just must go without knowing why. To make myself feel better or to feel the same. For fun, I say. Your documents are there in JPG format. An employee who has introduced herself as Vera shows me a black Dell laptop that has been ceremonially placed on a working desk in front of in the center of the room. The laptop seems so decrepit, I wonder if it was also a present. I'm told this is where researchers come, though I can't see any other researchers, only 3 other employees sipping Turkish coffee on their tables, placed around mine in a serving circle. One of them offers to make me espresso. I decline and seem to upset her, but Vera points out that I am the Marxist author of a book about freedom, which makes her smile and gesture as if this explained everything. If you need the files printed, or if you want to take PDF documents, there is a list with fees. You applied as a researcher, right? I nod, distracted by the question I have been mulling over in my head. Are there no physical files? I finally muster the courage to say it. The employee who offered to make me coffee gives me a strange expression as if she's trying to decide whether I'm trying to provoke her or let it go. Eventually, she tightens her lips, raises one eyebrow, and directs her index finger to the chair next to the researcher's desk. Be careful when you sit on that chair, she says. It wobbles. Also, the computer is slow. Don't keep pressing buttons or it will die. Just give it some time. The computer desktop is bare, deep blue with no icons on the dock other than the 3 files containing the information I have requested. They are labeled Form File 531, Leman Ypi, my grandmother, Inquisitive Judicial File 1355, Jafer Ypi, my father, Inquisitive Judicial File 1384, Aslan Ypi, my grandfather. I click on the mouse to open the first document and wait for what appears to be an eternity, but nothing happens. Then I move on to the second, then the third, and repeat the action. I start tapping at the keyboard, each time harder than the previous one, like a toddler discovering a piano, surprised to find that they have some control over it, but disappointed, just like me, it doesn't produce what they expect. Eventually, I give up pretending everything is going to plan, and look helplessly towards Vera, who is intensely studying the bottom of her coffee cup. I wait a few moments, then start pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete to restart the program. Avash, avash, she says when she notices. Take it easy, making a sign which I interpret as an order to vacate the chair. Which file do you want first? She says, once the computer has been restarted and the deep blue of the screen is back. Whichever you manage to open, I say. She nods, visibly satisfied. She continues to click competently until a yellow page appears, and the center of it I recognize my grandmother's name, handwritten in black pencil. I'm slightly distracted by the sound that the wooden chair makes as it starts to wobble, and a few seconds later I notice that it's my body that triggers the motion of the chair. It's shaking, as if it was standing naked in the middle of a frozen pit. I seem unable to control it, and I seem unable to concentrate on the meaning of the sentences that appear one after another, as I keep clicking and scrolling up and down. Top left of the page, Interior Ministry, Directorate of State Security and the People's Police Section of Internal Affairs. Top right, and almost faded, Extremely Secret. Further down, a more recent annotation. Fully declassified with decision number 15 taken on 30th May 2022 by the Authority for Information on the Documents of the former State Security. Several unintelligible words scribbled by hand in grey pencil. 2 lines with generalities. Name, surname, Leman Ypi, Further down, pseudonym. That line is empty. And though I can't be entirely certain of its meaning, for a split second my body stops shaking and I can hear myself breathing a sigh of relief. Then immediately after, I start to feel cold again, and my teeth are chattering. Is there air conditioning on? I ask the employees. It's so cold here. They look at me as if the question were rhetorical, a statement uttered mainly out of a desire to communicate something. Vera makes the clicking sound with her tongue. It was on this morning, she replies apologetically, but we turned it off because the director said we need to save energy now that we're at war. I must look perplexed. Well, we're in NATO, she says. Same thing. I nod in sign of understanding, then return to the page. I notice a drawing in the middle, a doodle, the shape of a perfect parallel pipette filled with small circles drawn around something that reads like sect, followed by a Roman number that looks like 7. Then my attention is caught by a single word that appears in the middle of the page and has been underlined 3 times. Greek. It makes no sense. And I continue to scroll until the same word appears again in the next page where other generalities are recorded. Citizenship, Greek. Name and surname, again, Leman Ypi. Place of birth, Salonika. Ethnicity, Albanian. Profession, employee of the Education Ministry. Religion, Muslim. Registered 29 December 1952. Name of referent who performed registration, Mayor HQ. Reason for registration, suspected as foreign agent. On page 6 of the file, the strange word, Greek, recurs again. Leman Ypi, born in Salonika, of Greek citizenship. A series of handwritten instructions also appear. Check if someone with this name and Greek citizenship is registered in File Collection 1 and File Collection 2, followed by another information. There is nothing here, with here underlined in pencil and signed Vice Colonel DB. Citizenship, Greek. Greek citizenship, I repeat to myself, then scroll back to the first page with a doodle where the word Greek has been written separately under the parallel pipette and followed by the proposal to categorize as 2B. It's bizarre to think of my grandmother as Greek. She spoke French to me most of the time, and although I knew she was born in Salonika, I hardly thought of Salonika as a place, let alone a Greek city. She always referred to it as Saloniki la Magnifique. But Saloniki la Magnifique has always been a sight of the mind for me, rather than location on earth. Not space, but time. A time lost before I could know it. Or a gallery of mental images, the painting of a stern old man with deep blue eyes, faded photographs in black and white capturing people I did not know and with whom casual resemblances of people I did know were pointed out. Most of the time, Saloniki la Magnifique was a combination of sounds, from French, Albanian, Turkish, Ladino, Italian, and yes, Greek, but only in small part. I keep reading the word Greek and it's hard to associate it to my grandmother. Instead, my mind wanders to my first exam at university in Rome, and the wobbly chair on which I was sitting then too, staring at the open page of Metaphysics Book Zeta, struggling with the question. Signorina, can you remember what Aristotle's term for essence in Greek is? The essence of an entity is what makes that entity be what it is. But how does Aristotle define it exactly? An embarrassing silence follows. Come on, Signorina. Everyone knows this. We covered it in class, and you also know it from your last year of high school. It seems inappropriate to point out that in my country, in the last year of high school, there was a war and everything was shut, and that we never studied Aristotle. We didn't even study philosophy. Back then, Aristotle was just the name of my next-door Greek Orthodox neighbor. If I really had to think of someone famous called Aristotle, only the second husband of Jackie Kennedy would occur. I roll my eyes, stare outside the window, and decide to count the tiles on the floor. I think that if I fail, the worst that can happen is that I'll lose my scholarship and return to Albania. Come on, Signorina. The Greek term for essence is toti en einai, what it is to be, which must be corrected, the examiner insists, to what it was to be. since the present tense has crept in later day translations and misled entire generations of Aristotle commentators. Right, I say. It's important, the examiner insists. So was the husband of Jackie Kennedy, I think. Now it turns out that my grandmother's Toti and Einai is also in her past. It turns out her essence, her what it was to be, her truth, is Greek. I continue to scroll down the file and up again, but at this point my brain has decided to play a trick on me. I'm only able to read the sentences where the term Greek appears. The rest is entirely unintelligible. Might as well have been written by Aristotle. There it is again, at top of page 7. On the basis of evidence concerning oppositional activity against the people and suspicions of being an agent for foreign intelligence services, in particular Greek ones, we propose to categorize as 2B and to prepare a preliminary investigation on citizen Leman Ypi, born in Saloniki of Albanian ethnicity and Greek citizenship. You always speak Greek when you have a secret. I must have been 5 or 6 the first time I uttered those words in anger. It was New Year's Eve and my grandmother's cousin Cocotte, who used to visit us during the winter, had just arrived on the evening train. One of their animated, mysterious conversations about Saloniki la Magnifique had been suddenly interrupted so they could switch off to Greek. I thought of it as a deliberate hostile act, intended to exclude me, or even worse, to sabotage my efforts at comprehension. A cruel method to convert a world accessible only with a huge imaginative effort into one fully impenetrable. No, she replied, we were just trying to remember the lyrics of a song we used to sing when we were little girls like you. And she sang it in Greek. Kanarini mugliko, esi mu pires tomaio. Sweet canary, I lost my mind for you. And again in Turkish, except that the word for kanarini, canary in Turkish, was bulbuli, the same as nightingale in Albanian, and the song felt comforting rather than threatening, like the chirping of birds on a balmy summer evening. I was so enraptured that since then she would sing it to me every night before going to sleep. Greek, I think. Greek, not like Aristotle, more like the Kanarini Mugliko. The chair has stopped wobbling. I have enough confidence to carry on reading. The reason and the material we dispose for a preliminary investigation are the following. 1. The fact that even though Leman Ypi has been living here for a long time, she continues to carry Greek citizenship. 2. The fact that even though she has been privately advised to apply for Albanian citizenship, she has not only rejected the option, but in the presence of the elements she trusts most, she has expressed hatred towards the People's Republic of Albania. She also expressed hatreds toward the Soviet Union, and indeed towards the whole socialist camp. On the other hand, she's praised life in Greece and the freedom enjoyed by people there. 3. Based on the contacts with our collaborator, the Tribune, in addition to what has been mentioned above, where she expressed hostility, she's gone even further, raising suspicions that she must be an agent of the Greek intelligence services. This for the following reasons. I stop reading. The chills on my spine are gone, but I've now started to feel nauseous. Maybe I haven't had breakfast, or maybe the canaries have disappeared, replaced by metaphysics zeta again. In the presence of the most trusted elements, I read again, then turn impatiently to the employees in the office. Who is this Tribune? I ask. What does 2B mean? Excuse me, Vera says. There's someone called the Tribune mentioned here who has made allegations that my grandmother was a Greek spy. I'm not sure this file is hers. It must be an informant pseudonym, she says. We don't know the real names, but if you look carefully in the file, there must be a list. I scroll up until a page appears entitled List of Collaborators with Pseudonyms. It contains only 3 lines, handwritten in fountain pen, with numbers appended to each, and I read them out loud. They sound like objects. 1, the Tribune. 2, second informant, white chewing gum. Third informant, wind of March. The employees laugh. They're all like that, they say, the pseudonyms. One wonders who came up with them. If you file a request for information as a family member, you can find the real names, Vera insists, noticing my distress. Then you'll know who was behind the whole thing. Was, I think. Is it all in the past? Her what it was to be? I look at the screen again, and again I'm unable to read past the word Greek. Do you want to find out who it was? Vera insists. I can show you how to fill the forms, and this is the list with the fees. End of reading. Okay, thank you. Thank you for thank you for your patience with it. So as I said, the title of the book, provisional title of the book, is Indignity, and it's in part a philosophical text, in part a political history, in part a literary family saga. And the core concept that it tries to explore is the moral and the political meaning of dignity in connection to questions of truth, historical injustice, reconciliation, and as you'll see in a minute, of the relationship between facts and fiction. So the book follows the first 35 lives of this character that I've just been reading to you about. My grandmother, who, as I said, is also a character in my last book, Free. And in that last book, which is a book about freedom in many ways, where the philosophical concept is freedom, she embodies a distinct idea of freedom, freedom as moral agency. And there's different ideas of freedom that are at play in the book, standard kind of negative ideas of freedom as non-interference, or positive ideas of freedom as opportunities for development or human flourishing. And there she's a character that plays this kind of Kantian role of articulating a notion of freedom as moral agency, in part in connection to the circumstances of her life. And it's an idea of freedom that is developed with the help of an explanation of the circumstances. And one of the questions that I had about that notion of freedom as I was writing Free was, well, what is this notion of freedom? How do we know it? How do we access it? How do we think about it? And since for me it was always connected to a kind of Kantian conception of freedom, the current book is an effort to unpack that conception of freedom, but by going back to what Kant says is, in the end, the core of that notion of freedom, which is human dignity. And it's human dignity because in that notion of freedom, freedom is articulated as moral awareness about agency, our capacity to have this agency regardless of material constraints. So what I want to do in the current book at this philosophical level, which is always kind of unpacked and articulated through with the help, as you saw, of literary detail, is to actually somehow probe that notion of freedom and to show it to the readers in a life, in history and in action, and to explain how it forms the core of human dignity and how it's reflected and also distorted in clashing political projects, all of which try to give you institutions that embody that idea of dignity, which are always the result of the legacy of the past, but which also leave an imprint on the politics of the present. So why is this character a good character through which to explore this notion of dignity? She was born in 1918. She was the youngest granddaughter of Ibrahim Pasha, is a fictional name in the book, who was a Beyler Bey of Rumelia, which was one of the larger provinces of the Ottoman Empire. She grew up in Salonika, where her grandfather, Ibrahim Pasha, had been exiled by the Sultan at one point, Sultan Abdul Hamid. She was of Albanian origin, and in fact, most of the Ottoman elites were of Albanian origin. It was a very mobile elite system, and it was also on the verge of modernizing at that point. The people who know about Ottoman history will know about the Tanzimat reforms and this kind of reform efforts to modernize the empire modeled on the French Revolution. And that's why everyone spoke French. It was the kind of language of the aristocracy, and that's why at her house everyone spoke French. And even though she was nominally Albanian, she'd actually never been to Albania until she was 20. As a matter of fact, in the year in which she was born, 1918, Albania didn't even exist as a state. It had existed, it had become independent from the Ottoman Empire in 1912. But in 1918, Serbia had annexed the north, Greece the south, France and Italy were contending a few scattered towns in the west, Bulgaria and Austro-Hungary were playing for the rest of the country. So this is kind of Albania when she was born, and she was sent to study in the Lycée Français in Salonika, again, as most Ottoman elites did at that time. She was in a school of mostly Sephardic Jews, which is why she sang in Latino, which was the dialect spoken by Sephardic Jews in Salonika, who were the biggest, they weren't a minority, the biggest ethnic group, if we can call them that, in Salonika at that time. And she only traveled to Albania at the age of 20, Albania by then had become a recognized state by the League of Nations, and she was the first woman to work in the Albanian administration. She was also very likely the first woman to propose to a man to marry her, which happened in King Zog's wedding. So this was the monarch, the president of Albania, which had declared himself king at some point, and they were in the wedding, and she met there, and she had met my grandfather and proposed to him to marry her. He was a card-carrying socialist, but the son of a collaborationist politician, and he had campaigned for the Popular Front at the time in which he was in France. In 1946, so they get married. 1946, the Second World War is over, and she took up Albanian citizenship, actually, and participated in the elections for the first Constituent Assembly, which were the first elections in which women could vote, and the last ones in which there were lots of different parties. After that, within a few weeks, her husband was arrested and was charged for agitation and propaganda and collaboration with the English operations of security services that had come to actually help the resistance in Albania to fight the fascists. But he was sentenced to 15 years of prison, and then a year later, a file was opened on her by the authority, by the State Security Service, whose files authority are the ones that I was referring to in my reading. She was deported before she became 30. She was a single mother, and 32, she was working in labor camps, and by 40, she had lost both parents. Her father she could never see after she left Greece. Her mother died in Albania, and most of her relatives in Albania had been executed or committed suicide, and or ended up in mental asylums, and she would just visit her husband in prison twice a year, and 3 times a year she was summoned with the offer to become an informant. So in the book, this is her story that's being told, basically from birth in this kind of aristocratic Ottoman family to decline, let's say, in the communist Albania. The story finishes. This past part of it is told by relying on 2 kind of distinct temporal narratives and distinct voices that describe the story. There's a first-person narrative, which is what I have just been reading, which describes the series of visits to the Secret Service archives and opening the files related to the family. And the perspective here is intergenerational one, so it's a younger Albanian woman who is trying to find the truth about her family history, and where the problem of dignity is closely related to the factual search for truth. So who spied on your grandmother? Why did they? What reasons did they have? What were their incentives? What justifications did they give? And the reason I go to about this part of the project doing exactly that is that there is a perception, when you think about historical injustice in post-communist societies like Albania, but indeed Eastern Europe more generally, the widespread perception is that when people have access to the truth of the files, they will have reconciliation. So they will need to know what's going on, and everything needs to come out in this kind of brutal, sometimes very lacerating way. But only after that, and only once we know who's collaborating, and so only truth will somehow bring people peace and make them reconcile with each other and make them at ease. And only that will help restore the dignity of victims. Now, this part of the book shows that there is that hypothesis, and that approach to historical injustice works only if there is a truth to find, and only if we can trust the mechanism through which that truth is transmitted, the vehicles through which it's reproduced. And the account that emerges in the second way of telling the story in the book is actually much more unsettling, because it turns out, as the book goes on to explore, that the archives have very little objective data. And so by the end of the book, and for reasons that I will explain in a minute that have to do with with what I found in the archives, you discover that, you ask yourself, okay, how can I tell the story of a life that I have not lived and that I'm only accessing through historical documents? And whose life is it that I'm actually writing about? And you'll see why I say that. So you discover that there is truth only if there is a kind of interpretation of the truth, and only if you trust the interpretation of that truth and the authorities that are in charge of interpreting the truth for you. And it turns out that these different interpretations are themselves the result of historical contingency. So to understand that, you need to move beyond the description of individual characters and individual events and the truth of individual families, and to engage with the broader historical and political context, because it turns out that facts by themselves are not reliable. And so while facts are not reliable, I think, and that's what the end of the book suggests, that there is a kind of philosophical truth about dignity that can be reconstructed with the help of literary imagination at the cross of history and fiction. So why do I say all this? How did I get to this philosophical conclusion and to making this argument over the course of the book? So this is the second person perspective on the books. I said first person is I'm telling the story of the archive. Second person is you try to imagine what this life might have been like, and it's like a third person author that tells the story. It's like the voice outside in cinema, you know. You follow her from her childhood in Saloniki to her adulthood in Tirana, and you see how she's trying to kind of become her own moral agent in a way and to assert her will against the circumstances. And you try to reconstruct her life with the help of family records, letters, but also more general historical documents. So not just documents about her, but you know, the bits on Saloniki are done with the help of newspapers from the period or memoirs written by other people or correspondence found of other people, visits, site visits, and so on. And where the text reads like a historical novel, but actually the plot and the characters are instrumental to reconstructing the context and to explain why she ended up being in this position at this point. You know, why did she marry this person? Why was she at the mercy of the authorities? What decisions did they make? What political stance did they take to get to this point? So on the first perspective, when you look at the archives, you see her from the point of view of the state and the way the state interprets her dignity in a way. And you see also who followed her. You can read everything, the depositions of family members. You can read, I have access to my grandfather's files. So what he said to the police, what the police said to him, you read everything. There's very, very accurate record keeping. And in the second case, you can make sense of her in dialogue with her contemporaries and with the effort that is made by someone completely external, who is more like a writer or a kind of artist or someone who tries to recreate this life. And at the end of the book, the two perspectives converge and lead to a more general philosophical question about how you can reconstruct dignity in a way. So which of these two approaches to dignity is the more appropriate. Now, why did I get to this blurring of perspectives and to this general question of the relationship between facts and fiction? I was initially planning to write the book just in the third person, so just to try and reconstruct my grandmother's life with the help of the documentation. And I was going to center on these questions of state and nation building in the Balkans, discussing topics of individual and collective dignity, because many of these state building projects were also projects that were trying to affirm the dignity of the nation in the aftermath of the collapse of empires and so on. I wanted to work on this period because the interwar is one of the most interesting historical periods and the one that resonates most with the present, where you really, before this kind of, you have this sense of financial crisis, impending global crisis, interconnection of states, deglobalization, preparation for some kind of world war. And also it's a period where human dignity is celebrated in the legal international documents that emerge from that period, you know, the Lausanne Treaty, the Geneva Convention, the birth of the kind of United Nations formalization of international law. But right after that, you get, you know, the fascist and the actually destruction of dignity. So it's the period where it's most celebrated legally, just as we now have, you know, a celebration of human rights and so on. But then you have war crimes and destruction of dignity politically. And so the effort is to think about, you know, how to negotiate individual or moral dignity with collective dignity. So, okay, just the last bit of the project. When I started working on the project, I started, as I explained through the reading earlier, traveling to the archives in communist Albania to try and find out as much as I could about my grandmother. And during the first visit, I started seeing some strange things in the files that didn't seem to be quite right, given what I knew about my grandmother. And most perplexing of them were two things. One, she was reported as a widow and as someone whose husband died in the war, and her child, who was my father, was never mentioned. And that was one strange thing, because my grandfather died very late, so not at the point in which the files were being written. And the second one was that my grandmother had a child already in 43, so the fact that the child was never mentioned in the files in 53 was also very weird. And so I started asking around in the archives about this, and you know, how is it there are these inaccuracies, and how can that be? And they said to me, the employees said, and the researchers were saying that these are very common mistakes that you find in files like this, because there are gaps in information by the informants themselves who don't have access to everything. So sometimes people are under pressure and they just write something, but they don't go to fact check. They say, I heard her husband died, but then they don't, you know, maybe the husband is in prison and they don't realize it's in prison. It's just something they report. My mom had a more, when I was explaining to her that I was finding all these things in the files, she had a more kind of sinister interpretation. She said that my grandmother has a cousin who was an acquaintance of Enver Hoxha, the leader of the Albanian Communist Party, so very, very high up. And well, actually, you know, the equivalent of Stalin in Albania, and that this cousin had actually closed her file, had interfered to close her file with a death certificate, which was the other perplexing thing I had found, which was that there was a death certificate of her in 1953, and that's how the file was closed. So she had suggested that this relative had interfered to close the file with a fake death certificate so that she wouldn't be followed by the police anymore. Okay, all of which was sort of weird, and I kept following through to try and understand, you know, who in my effort to find the truth. And then it turned out that all of this was completely off the mark, because doing more research, I discovered that there was another Leman Ypi, which is not a common name in Albania, born in Saloniki in the same year, from the same family background, who had come to Albania with her single mother in the same war years, from the same, as I said, circumstances, so Ottoman elites, landowners, and so on and so forth, and who was also under surveillance. So since the information I was reading sometimes was completely accurate, so it was like, you know, character description, features, was my grandmother, and sometimes completely off the mark, because, you know, there was this death certificate and so on, it turned out that there was a filing error in the system, so that some informants were reporting about my grandmother and some informants were reporting about this other woman who had the same circumstance, because they got confused. And so this was actually confirmed in later documents that I found in the trial of one of the informants, the Tribune that I just mentioned, who was actually killed for giving false information, for making a mistake in the files themselves, because I was trying to find the truth about who is this informant, and then it turned out the informant had died himself. And I also found that this other Leman, this other woman, had died alone. She had died really in 1953, not married, leaving no descendants. So in a way, she had no kind of granddaughters who could record her life and who could tell the truth of her life and reflect on the meaning of her dignity. But I thought her life also deserved to be recorded somehow. And so I decided to kind of adopt her and to blur the character and imagine what her life might have been alongside my grandmother's life, and to also give her the dignity of memory in a way, which is how you think about dignity after someone's died, through these mechanisms of memory. And so since the two characters were similar enough to confuse the spies, I decided that instead of canceling one, the fake grandmother, or she wasn't fake, she was real, but not the unrelated one, and keep the one that was my grandmother, that was related to me, I decided to actually keep both of them and to use the project as a way of raising this question of what is the role of someone who thinks about truth and wants to reconstruct the truth. And so instead of having to choose whether the book is more fiction or more literary, I thought I would use this as a way of thematizing what dignity means and how we think about it. And, you know, the reference to what we know and what we can imagine, and, you know, articulating this question of the relationship between facts and interpretation. And so I thought that the book would then become, in addition to this initial question of dignity that I wanted to explore, would become a way of tracing, in a way, the continuity of history in literature, which is what the book does. There are bits of it that are historical and there are bits that are imagined, and of literature's input into history. Because sometimes I think what you recreate, or what the artist recreates, is more true than what the authorities give you to reflect on through the files, and so on. So this hybrid character, Leman, who is basically now part fictional and part not, is an interesting character through which to go back to this initial question of historical injustice and reconciliation with which I started, but also more generally the question that Schiller raises in The Gods of Greece, and now I'm really getting to the end of my talk, about how to engage with division and conflict in the present and where to look for reconciliation, because the political identity of she has is one of a unit that doesn't exist anymore. And in a way, her morality is revealed in this kind of constant struggle to fight over context and to kind of emerge as a moral agent in the context. And her efforts are reconstructed by someone who is making a kind of imaginary effort, like Schiller says that, you know, the gods live in the imaginations of the poets. And so in this case, there is a writer who is reflecting on the meaning of her dignity, not just based on what the facts on the ground are telling you about that dignity. And so the question is, what is the possibility of reconciliation under conditions of present injustice? And the dilemma, the question that the book grapples more generally is the same as Schiller's one, where Schiller says, why is it that the artist has this role to reflect on morality and on reconciliation in the current world? Because he says, and I think I agree with it, when the constitution is wrong, when the existing state of affairs is unjust and is marred by inequality and conflict and injustice, there is no way in which you can have a truth that is completely separate from propaganda and from manipulation and from the way in which particular dominant historical and political forces want you to access the truth. And it's only when one makes an effort of the imagination that one leaves that manipulated truth, as it were, this propaganda behind, and tries to rise above the circumstances. And that's why Schiller says in the letters on aesthetic education that, you know, it's only when the artist tries to think about the relationship between beauty and morality that you actually can hope to have some kind of reconciliation. Because the idea is that an unjust state can't give you reconciliation in the mechanisms that it offers you to access the truth about the facts on the ground, or between social relations, or between political relations. So if the interpretation of facts is always a result of ideology and vulnerable to propagandistic manipulation, my suggestion, like Schiller, is to turn to art and to this idea, to the power of imagination in reorienting our intuitions and in reorienting human beings towards morality. And so that's why at the end of the book, it actually doesn't really matter who the actual person is, because what matters is not the facts about my grandmother, but the interpretation of the facts. It's the kind of story that one tries to tell more generally, and the reading of history that one tries to offer more generally. And so that's why she's a generic character. See, she's half existent, half constructed, half the product of someone's literary effort, half a real existing figure, and is a kind of particular human, but it's also an effort to connect to the humanity of all the readers and of all the kind of public that tries to think about these questions of historical injustice. So reconciliation in the end is not about reaching the end of a process, but finding a way of engaging with conflicts of the present. So it's not about the truth that you find, but it's about what kind of social relations you try to have and what kind of contribution your work gives to existing social and political relations in a way that connects reflecting on the injustices of the present with reflecting on the injustices of the past. And so the answer, in a way, is the same answer as Schiller gives in this poem on the gods of Greece. The instrument of political education is art, because, as Schiller argues, art is like science, free from everything that is positive or established by human convention. And both of them try to have immunity from the lawlessness that characterizes the state of affairs. And so art, rather than politics, is the instrument of reconciliation, because, as Schiller says, and this is a quote with which I'm going to wrap up, the political legislator can enclose the territory but can't govern with it. He can proscribe the friend of truth, but truth endures. He can humiliate the artists, but the art he can't debase. And so if Schiller is right, and if art is the only sphere that can free itself, if it can, but if, you know, I think there's very little hope everywhere, but I think there's a little bit more hope in this effort to use the imagination in this way to free itself from political manipulation, then you can understand why the truth of someone's life is, and also as a result of that, the ultimate meaning of their dignity is not in the historical truth about her, but in the philosophical reconstruction of that truth. And so just as important as the recording of the facts is the vindication that one can give, and that vindication one can get to through this connection between literature and philosophy. So that's it. I hope that was clear. Thank you.
thank you very much. I'm sure there will be many questions. We have people both online and here, and you can just put up your hand if you want to ask a question, and Karim will register it. And you online, you can write in the chat that you want to ask a question, so that Lea knows where your question is coming from. Please state your discipline if you're a researcher. And we also take follow-up questions that you can mark with a finger if you're sitting here or write the name of the person you're following up to. Lea, I just want to ask you quickly about something you said en passant, I think. And I think you said that you want to investigate dignity by literary imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And is that because you think that getting a grip on dignity, you can't use the usual kind of methods in philosophy, trying to give cases and definitions more like Michael Sandel or Michael Rosen or those kind of books? Or is that, do you see that there is perhaps something about dignity that you can't really access?
Yeah.
Standard methods, but you can access by using this kind of literary imagination.
I think the way I would depict the difference between literature and philosophy is actually not on the cases, because I think at that level you could think of a literary work as presenting a case study or intuition pumping or whatever. So I find I can do exactly the same thing with writing a kind of chapter in a novel as what you can do with an article in philosophy, where you start with an intuition or you start with an example, and just that here it comes usually from, well, I mean, it's the same use of the imagination. So I don't think that's, I would say it's more in the educational, in the kind of pedagogical approach to it that it differs. So in philosophy you start with the cases and you start with the intuitions, and you want to go with the intuitions somewhere and come to a conclusion. In philosophy, in literature, if you do that, you write very bad literature, and you're also not very effective on the readers, actually, because they get put off. There's something paternalistic about a text in which you're given a premise and a conclusion, and then these characters are given to you in a way that naturally leads to people endorsing your conclusion. So what you want to have is, in some ways, showing the flaws at every, it's almost like a philosophical work that can't come to a conclusion somehow, where, you know, there is a logic of it, but the logic is always constantly contradictory. And I find in philosophy, that's something that would lead to very bad philosophy. If you were to do that, where you constantly, you know, take a side and then you say, but like, look now, it's as if you're trying to assert a position and then taking all the counterpoints of all your adversaries in the literature and feeding them into your position in such a way that you actually can't get to your position. So that would be very bad philosophy. In literature, if you did that with character, if you try to do good philosophy in a literary manner, it would be very bad literature, because you'd end up writing a text that is just didactic and kind of preaching somehow. It's really like a piece of propaganda, actually, and propaganda literature. So what you do is, I think you have the same use of cases and intuitions, and this is how I think about the chapters when I'm trying to think about how do I convey, let's say, a Kantian idea of dignity. And it plays very slowly over many chapters with lots of different detail and character construction and plot and so on. But the idea is that it works on the reader in a way that doesn't convert them, but it tries to say to them, okay, can you embrace all these different contradictions? And then ask yourself all these different questions, but you don't write the conclusion for them. They write the conclusion for themselves. And in some ways, I guess the contribution, I mean, I don't know if you can get to dignity in that way, but what you can do is, I think, the readers ask themselves a lot of questions. And so you have this Socratic exercise that is ongoing. And the act of kind of confronting the reader and giving them the text is actually the playing out of the Socratic exchange somehow.
I was thinking about the Socratic methods. Sound quite close to it. But
It is very close, but it doesn't, you know, Socrates is always right in the end.
Yeah.
Somehow, even though he says he doesn't know if he's right,
exactly.
he has an answer. With this kind of stuff, I think you can't really have an answer. I mean, you can have a theory, and this is the theory that I've just explained, is that you can get to it somehow, but it's not as firm and not as clear, I think. It has to embrace ambiguity in a way in which, if you try to embrace ambiguity, at least in analytical political theory, it's terrible. If you embrace clarity that much in literature, it's also terrible. So it's kind of,
Can be more said about that, but I should just leave the floor to Anandi. A microphone to you.
Thank you. I'm a philosopher of mind and language, which turns out to be relevant to my question, because I'm going to make a case for the relevance of certain discussions in philosophy of mind and language to some of the things that you said. So my thinking about this was sort of triggered by something that you said that sounded very provocative, but also to my ear just kind of false. And this was that the facts are not reliable. And first of all, the facts are not reliable. And second of all, that, you know, we can use the literary imagination to get at the real truth or something like that. So what puzzled me, it sounds provocative, but what sounds provocative also sounds a little bit off. Like, how can the facts not be reliable? Maybe it's a certain representation of the facts that's not reliable. And if you're getting at the real truth, how could that be through imagination, which is this kind of exercise in fantasy? And so here's the point about relevance. So with regard to the distinction between the facts as they are and the representation of the facts, I thought there were certain very interesting things about the story that you told. One was the sort of Leman Ypi case was very much like Kripke's Paderewski case. You know, so there's these two. There's two names. It's the reverse of the Paderewski case, but you have a file and you have this mistake in the file that's about two different people, but it looks like it's about the same person. And then there's another kind of case, there's sort of Frege cases where you have the same object that's being represented in different ways. And so I think that those kinds of distinctions, right, the distinction between representation and what's being represented could really help to sort of, I don't know, make it easier to see what you're saying, right, about the facts versus the way in which they're represented. And the other thing I was thinking might be relevant is, you know, there's a lot of discussion about imagination as constrained, right, constrained by some information that you have. So it's not just free association or free use of imagination, but you can often use imagination. People talk about in terms for finding out about counterfactuals, to find out about facts, actually. So I wonder whether those kinds of ways of thinking about what you're saying would be helpful to sort of get at what you're
yeah, great, thank you.
Say.
Yeah, that's very helpful, actually really helpful. I didn't know about either Kripke or the Frege stuff, so I'm going to go and look it up. Maybe I'll talk to you also about it later. So I think, yes, and I think I was, what I want to say goes more, and it's a softer version of what you started with, what I'm really saying, which is about constraints on facts, because in the end I am taking a lot of facts on board as well, and indeed there are facts that play a role in the narrative, and so it's not all made up. So when I was talking about the different voices in the book, so there is a voice that just imagines and a voice that just reports the facts that it finds. You know, you could also decide, once you don't trust the facts, okay, then forget about anything you found in the files. So why are you even telling us this story? Why don't you just make up the whole thing? You know, I went and I invented the file and I found the file and I invent everything. So there is a sense in which I do respect some of, so there is a sense in which I agree with you that imagination has a kind of disciplinary role to play, rather than just saying, okay, since I can't trust it, then I don't trust anything. I guess what I was trying to say, though, is that when it comes to the facts of history, there is always an interpretation of those facts behind them. And the reason we don't trust them is that sometimes the interpretations are morally flawed. And we see the failures in the reporting of the facts that are actually not failures of record keeping, they're actually failures of morality somehow, if I'm making this clear. So in a way, the reason we can't trust them, the reason we think there is this propaganda and manipulation. So what all of these things are, they are ways of writing or telling the stories and recording the facts in a way that is flawed. But flawed not just from a kind of perspective of I couldn't find them, or they're not technical, just technical gaps. There is a kind of moral flaw that underpins the technical flaw, let's say. So what I was where I'm trying to go with this idea of the art and so on is that if we don't challenge the morality behind the interpretations, and if we don't think about the role that, you know, what is the point of view from which propaganda or from which manipulation of opinion or manipulation of the facts works on the readers and on the public by convincing them, look, this is actually the truth when it's not the truth. There is a moral perspective that's being taken for granted and that everyone accepts. That's what I think one can do with art, because it's in a position of permanent dissidence in a way, and or philosophy for that matter, because it's in a position of constantly scratching the surface and saying, well, does this interpretation of reality or this interpretation of the facts, what is the moral perspective that it reflects? Is that right? Is it wrong? and be much more open about it than what you find if you just take the facts at face value. And so this is where I was going with this idea that what I think the role of the artist or the philosopher, and I say, I mean, I think of art and philosophy in many ways as truth-seeking missions. I mean, they have this, as we were going back to this initial question, they have different ways of thinking about the truth and different efforts to kind of think about how you write the truth and how you communicate it and what are the communities, the relevant communities and so on. But I think in that sense, they're broadly inspired by that. And maybe that's the difference between actually politics, which is a much more a more one-sided way, I think, of reflecting on facts and on history. But yeah, thanks. That's very helpful.
Leman? You're gonna get a microphone here.
Well, thanks. Naima Shabun, Political Theory, Stockholm University. My question is very closely aligned to that of Gustav. He asked about whether you thought that writing fiction was a way to like complement the methods we have as philosophers. And your answer kind of pointed in the direction to fiction as an illustration of philosophical ideas, which seems clearly uncontroversial. So I just wanted to push you a little bit on that. To what extent would you agree or disagree with the proposal that literary fiction is not only a method for philosophical illustration, but actually a method for philosophical discovery? This is being proposed right now by some people. Personally, I feel kind of skeptical to that idea, but also I haven't tried it out. So I'm very curious to hear your view. And if you could say something to what extent you did discover something about what dignity is while writing or preparing for your writing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I'm with you actually on that. So I don't think that you have the tools with writing fiction that lead you to philosophical discovery. But I think what they do is they make you more, they make you check your errors more somehow. So I think it's more of a kind of falsifying device than a verifying device for me. So the way I think of fiction is I had my views on dignity and they came from philosophy and moral agency. And so I have my kind of Kantian convictions. I don't think anything I wrote brought me to challenge any of those kind of core philosophical convictions. But what it did do is it made me, I think, have more robust counter arguments, because as I write characters, you can't write persuasive characters in literature if you don't inhabit those characters. So when you're writing, I have a Nazi character in my book, for example, that plays a very important role. Actually, also to some extent, it's a kind of story. I wanted to tell a story about dignity, which is that, every person, when they're morally culpable, know it, which is a kind of Kantian story about conscience. So every violation of moral duty is known to the person who is violating. And so there's this Nazi character who does wrong things throughout the book and then knows it. And then there is a moment at the end of the book where he kind of redeems himself by offering something that the characters don't pick up. But in a way, it's his attempt to kind of rescue himself. Now, if you're writing a Nazi character, you can't write a character that you hate. It's not a convincing character. You have to actually inhabit the character. You have to see the world from his perspective. You have to think like a Nazi, which is what challenges you as an author or as a philosopher with kind of strong convictions, because, you don't have, obviously you have characters that you like and you don't like, or you like more, but when you're writing them, especially in this third person, so not from the first person where you're inhabiting one of the characters, when you're writing as a kind of outsider and you're just trying to write the kind of, just to use a metaphor now from different arts, or from painting, you kind of try to get the tapestry right. You can't do one character really well and another character just to give the sense of the readers, you have to hate this guy, he's really evil. That's like the worst of realist socialist literature that I read when I was a child, where just, there was this character this author that was trying to convince, like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. I think it doesn't work. It's not good literature. So if you want to write good literature, you have to inhabit every character. And inhabiting every character, you have to inhabit every philosophical perspective that you're trying to challenge somehow. I'm obviously not a Nazi, and I don't want to convince people that it's right to be a fascist or a Nazi, but I do want to give the world from his point of view, and actually to make the best case I can make for that world, rather than just say, well, here's a caricature version. I want to take his commitments as sincere, in a way, not as just someone who is just evil. And to show these dilemmas, helps, I think, for philosophy, because you are somehow, as I say, embracing skepticism much more than you would if you were set out to destroy your adversaries or counter arguments or objections. And so it's a mechanism for checking, I think, the truth that you have discovered somehow independently. But I'm not convinced that it's, at least it hasn't worked for me yet. That, you know, it's not, when I wrote the other characters that had alternative points of view, they didn't convince me that actually maybe these points of view were more convincing. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, just a short follow-up. We have a colleague that just had published a dissertation on Iris Murdoch and her argument of why literature cannot be philosophical. Have you kind of taken in those claims, and because they seem to be a challenge to the project? So
no, I haven't. I don't know it, but
our colleague is Lyra Ekström Lindbeck.
okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you. No, that's
She's also an author.
very good. Yeah, great, thank you.
Very good. Then we have Christer, so we need to get a microphone all the way down again.
Hi, I'm a philosopher, practical philosopher. So I was thinking, I mean, to some extent you touched upon it already, but there's a sort of move in philosophy of science arguing that fiction and fictional worlds can be seen as models. So you can actually use them to test ideas. You can be philosophical ideas, but it doesn't have to be. And you have sort of a surrogate system, which is the imagined world, which is supposed to tell you something about the target world, which is the real world, right? So in this case, I guess dignity might be one of the targets, dignity in the real world, all right? There are a lot of sort of pros with that, right? I mean, there are general pros with modeling because you can sort of simplify, idealize, you can sort of control the environment, you can test things, right? Changing the story slightly and see what happens the next morning, the different sort of contexts and so on in the fiction. But you said something about this saving the provocative title that beauty saves the world, can save the world. Well, doesn't it depends on whether these imaginary models actually are good models, right? Because if you have rubbish in, you get rubbish out, right? You think about economic models or very, you know, simple neoclassical models, they seem to have pretty very false sort of inputs or sort of assumptions built into the models, right? And you mentioned this thing that there's a sort of risk that if you live in an unjust society, you sort of manipulate it and so on. Yeah, but that might actually continue in your imaginary world, right? You set it up in such a way that your sort of manipulated or sort of skewed sense of justice is actually there in the model too, in the imaginary world, right? So how do you avoid that, right? I think that's difficult, right? It's difficult in ordinary modeling too, so it's not
yeah,
especially, but yeah.
Yeah, great. Yes, absolutely. I think the bias stays. I would say there's maybe, I'd like to maybe reflect here on the spot on a few differences. So one of the differences, I think, at least with, I mean, there's obviously different kinds of fictional writing. This is an effort at fictional writing that is more historical. So in that sense, the problem with the difference with completely made up models and historical models is that the historical models reflect on real failures and real fallacies and real problems. And so in some ways, it also constrains, it's both constraining and enabling. It's constraining because you're thinking about real obstacles as opposed to imagined obstacles. And so in that sense, it becomes more relevant, but it's also, but it's also enabling to have just the purely fictional models because you don't have any of the constraints. So for the same reason that it's limiting, it's also enabling, I think, which is why personally, I think you should have both in a way. You should have both the kind of historical modeling and the non-historical and just kind of free flow, free reign of imagination. One of the differences, though, I would say in between the kind of theoretical modeling and the fictional one is that in the fictional world, you're always having human characters and they're not consistent. So imagine a modeling where you have non-inconsistent actors all the time. So in our philosophical thought experiments, we assume that the person who has certain conceptions or views or commitments has these commitments consistently and maintains them, and they are fixed in the model. In this case, they are constantly changing, and they are also, you know, they have passions, they have human flaws, they have anger. There's a lot of other things that they're not purely rational in a way. They're constantly this constant mix of rational and irrational, which I don't know what it does to the model more generally. In a way, it makes the model less of an accurate guide, again, because it's less philosophically consistent. And that's why I don't think it can have all the burden. I mean, it's not, for me, it's more of a contribution to a more broader democratic exercise and a kind of broader division of labor in terms of what each of us can bring. And I was making this argument for the imagination because I was thinking about the role in reflecting on the limits of propaganda and ideology, and in the fact that artists are often aware of that more so than people who are just in a system of reproduction of certain beliefs that is maybe just kind of self-reproducing. But yeah, so how do I want to answer your question? I think completely I agree that they are the limits are there, and they are carried over in the ideal world and in the kind of projection of the models. Maybe there is a way in which this is about raising awareness about limits rather than just taking all the burden and saying, well, I can do it, I can fix it. And so it's maybe about different ways of thinking about different kinds of models and what they can do and they can't do. So I see it as a part of a kind of pluralistic effort in a way. The title came from a Dostoevsky novel where The Idiot, where it's actually one of the questions that one of the characters says, can beauty save the world? And it's actually the challenge of that novel. And yeah, I can't remember now how he answers it. It's a great novel, but I don't remember actually it's telling that I don't remember the philosophical points that he makes. I remember it's a great reading experience. So maybe one doesn't take them for the kind of contribution to giving a philosophical answer, but more for how they make us think about philosophical questions.
Happy with that, Christer? We have two follow-ups.
Just one small thing. So models doesn't have to be models of rational behavior. Of course,
Right.
they're models of randomness and biases, right? So
Right. Yeah.
I had the same question because I didn't understand this thing about consistency and inconsistency.
Okay, so maybe I was just wrong.
Oh.
I don't know. This is how when I was thinking about kind of thought experiments in philosophy, I had in mind more consistent, but maybe, yeah. It's just,
Yeah, I mean, even going outside, I mean, you try to model things where people behave in erratic manners or
right.
anything from trembling hands to whatever. There's lots of things like that.
And you can model that like
Yeah.
across with the same kind of character.
Yeah, and you can also have learning profiles and people learn things. I mean,
Okay.
so there's a whole thing there. Anandi?
Yeah, I also had a follow-up about, but it was more about, it seemed to me like you were saying that the interpretation or the model that you get from the exercise of literature is somehow more true. And then, so I'm just wondering about that. What grounds you think? So, I mean, Christer asked about how you can avoid the same kinds of bias, but why not think that why not think that the literary approach is just another kind of bias?
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling with this question. I actually still keep thinking, and I kind of go back and forth. So I don't have as settled views on it as maybe I look, or maybe I had when I started, because I completely take the point that every form of art and every art product and every, the fashions that there are and so on, in a way, in a world in which we live now, much more so than in the world maybe in which Schiller lived, are always also the result of a given historical period and of all the constraints and inherit and reflect all the biases of that historical period. I was thinking about, though, so the way I got to this was by thinking about the question of reconciliation, and actually in post-communist societies and historical injustice societies, where it's literally about the truth of the documents. And what I'm trying to say is that when you raise the question as the truth of the documents, what you're trying to do is you're separating between a time in which, this truth is recorded and the time in which we're now, where we're accessing this truth. And we both trust the vehicles of transmission. So we trust the record keepers and we trust the archives and so on. But also, I think we're less prone to reflect on the limits of the time in which we are, that we have our own biases, because our own reflection on historical injustice is also the result of an unjust society. I don't think the world is fine now, as it were. So I think all of those biases that were there in a particular historical period, we have maybe other kinds of biases, or we have biases that have built over those biases, but I don't think we are free from biases. And my concern and my intervention in this literature on historical injustice, which is really the dominant position, at least in my neck of the woods, is that, now we just have to kind of clean up the stuff by bringing out the records and bringing out the files. And the whole project is intended to challenge that. And maybe the second part, I think you're right, is more provocative in saying, actually, not only is that not as true as you think, but maybe there is this other way of doing it, which is maybe even more true than the truth that you think you find. And on that one, I think Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how willing I am to die on that hill, that it's even more true. But I think there is something to the position of the artist in society and to their kind of dissidence generally towards power and efforts to reflect on constraints, or at least critical artists. I mean, obviously there's also forms of art even in our societies that just reproduce the states of affairs. But again, there, I don't think of art as completely independent from morality. The kind of artist that I have in mind is an artist with moral commitments and with views about justice and injustice in society, and that is trying to kind of reflect critically. And I think if you are trying to have that critical distance and you are also trying to think about the work of art as something that contributes to raising awareness of those limitations of the societies in which we live, I think you are at the better position than the researcher that is just trying to bring out the archives or to bring out the records. And in a way, it's the difference between history as simpliciter, so just history as events and characters and so on, and philosophical history, where you're thinking about history always from a moral perspective. And I think something similar applies to art and literature. When you think about it from a moral perspective, then I think you have a higher chance of being maybe more aware of, as I say, the limits of the present. So it's a more nuanced way of saying the same thing, I think. Yeah.
Very good. There's time for more questions, so please put up your hands. But we now have the next question, which is Karim. I already noticed that. So.
Thanks. First of all, thanks a lot for the, seems like a fantastic book. So yeah, I have a question. I suppose I want to kind of push a bit on this discussion that's been emerging here from others too about the truth and art and versus fact-based. And I suppose that I'm not a historian, but I'm very interested in history, but also about the kind of the meta history or discussion historiography. And I wouldn't say that history is a perfect science by any means, but the idea is that, you know, you have a collection of facts, you try to assemble a narrative that fits those facts, and then you try to be as transparent as possible by, like, first how you came by those facts and the sources of those facts, and how your deductive process went like. And then someone else can take those facts and maybe add additional facts and additional stories and challenge that narrative. And over time, you have a discourse on various interpretations. And I suppose that the kind of aim or hope of this process is to reach to a conclusion that is as close to the truth as possible. So, of course, it's not a perfect process, but it requires this kind of dialogue and the kind of transparency between the historian and the sources, and trying to do much what you wanted to do. But yeah, so I suppose that so I suppose the first part of my question would be like, why is that not a good model for arriving at the truth, that which is important? So and the second part of the question would be kind of to challenge the, I mean, you rely on Schiller, which is of course a fantastic poet and so on, but also, I mean, he has a very romantic view, to say the least, about artists and how like art can save the world, etc., etc. And we know from history that art has been as corrupted as philosophy, as journalism, or even more. I mean, just look at Leni Riefenstahl or all the propaganda war movies from Hollywood, Top Gun, etc. It's so fun to blow up people. So it feels like you're letting the artists off a bit too easily, I think, in your argument here. I think maybe there should be more critical light placed upon contemporary art.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Okay, this is really helpful. About the historians. So there's one of the reasons why, and so I'm going to say something about why I'm so harsh on historians, and then why I'm so soft on artists, and try to kind of moderate my position and think about both of them. So one of the reasons is that there are certain types of history that just don't capture certain subjects. When I was, and this is a very simple example I'm going to give you from the book, and then I can kind of expand on that. But I'm trying to write about this woman who was born in the Ottoman Empire. And the first thing that happens to me is I go to Saloniki to find the archives, and I'm told, actually, if you're searching for a woman, it's very unlikely that you'll find anything. They just don't exist. They're just not recognized in those archives because they are the archives that are based on legal titles, on property documents, on, you know, even before, because also population wasn't really registered. The passport is a relatively recent invention. So you look for citizenship. That's when you begin to have a little bit more of a sense of female subjects as well. Before that, when you don't have the passports and the kind of population records that we have now with civil registers, it has to be all based on property. And because women weren't really, they weren't really allowed to have property, you know, when I went to Salonika to ask for the bits of her life in Salonika, I couldn't find anything in the archives. And I was told explicitly, look, if you can come and search for the men, you know, the husband, the father, the grandfather, maybe you'll find something. With women, if you come with their name and surname, it's, you know, you won't find anything. In her case, I could find a little bit because she went to school, so there were school records. If she had been someone who was uneducated, I wouldn't have been able to find anything. They just don't exist. So there are some subjects that are just not captured by history. And the reason is that the way in which the record keeping works for that historical period is to exclude certain subjects because of the interpretation of reality that just doesn't make them visible somehow. Now, I mean, we don't have that bias. Maybe we have other biases that we're not aware of. So I don't know, maybe we're not capturing animals in our records or plants or whatever. There may be other gaps in our philosophical reconstruction of reality that will kind of reflect. But the idea is that an artist or a literature person or a philosopher has tools that are not available to the historian in thinking, okay, I can't find the facts about this woman, but what would it have been like to be a woman given everything else I know about this society? And I can use my imagination to just kind of put her in this place or in that place, make her respond to incentives in this way and that way. So it kind of softens, I think it tempers the biases of the historian. Now, I completely agree with you that the art can also just be propaganda. And I don't want to go, and I'm not part of the romantic tradition that wants to set art against philosophy, in particular moral philosophy. So the whole point of the romantic project was to say, philosophy is here, art is here, they're just different, and we can get a lot more out of art than we can get with philosophy. And I'm not on that camp. So, and I actually don't think, I mean, we can have a discussion about Schiller later. I don't think Schiller was quite on that camp because what Schiller was trying to do with his poem and with his project and with this whole kind of movement that emerges that is pre-romantic rather than exactly romantic is to actually think about Kantian philosophy and why did the Kantian moral system that animated many of the political movements that was kind of embedded in many of these political revolutions of the 18th century, why did it fail so badly in the end? Why did this kind of abstract morality turn into the reign of terror of the French Revolution? And he thinks it's because people's aesthetic sensibilities, because of their, you know, passions and feelings, and there were other parts of their humanity in a way that were conspiring against the Kantian moral system because people are flawed. They're not, you know, they're not just morally motivated. So how can literature, that was his project, I think, how can literature contribute to refining humans' moral, how shall I put it, kind of to refining us from a moral perspective and to make us more inclined to receive the kind of demands of morality in a way that doesn't lead to just pure coercion and the type of violence that resulted with the French Revolution. That was kind of his project. So, and in fact, he was in a direct conversation with Kant about this because, you know, he says at some point he writes this letter for anyone who wants to know about the ins and outs of this, but he writes this letter to Kant and he says, why do you say that we can't work with moral feelings to make human beings more receptive towards morality? And Kant replies saying, well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't work with moral feelings. I'm just saying it's not what drives them to be moral, but then that we can educate people from a moral perspective. That's part of the project in a way of moral anthropology and of more empirical sciences. And I think Schiller thought and was right, and that's where I'm trying to go, that this is exactly what we should be doing. So we should have the kind of literature and the kind of art that thinks about refining moral sensibility and that doesn't think of, okay, morality is here and art is here and we are better than. So in a way, it's a kind of reconciliation project, but it's not, I don't think the project works if you just abandon the moral perspective. Now, we can have another conversation about how, you know, you can take it one step further and say, well, you can be a moral philosopher and also be a victim of propaganda and so on. That I'm a little bit more skeptical of because there has to be a point where reason can be separated from power structures and we can think about stuff independently from power structures. At least that's kind of where I draw the line. That's what I'm committed to. But with everything else, I'm on board. So
just a short follow-up. But okay, so yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that was a good explanation. But isn't there a risk that, so as I described, this kind of historical method, which relies on these kind of openness of sources, on the kind of transparency in reporting those results and so on. And I agree. I mean, there are subjects that are not well recorded, and that's why, you know, history, I think, to a much greater degree, needs to rely on other subjects like archaeology and anthropology and so on, and literature, especially contemporary literature. But doesn't the fictionalization of a historical event impede progress in the historical understanding? I mean, this is kind of, I'm not saying that you're doing it, because you probably, if a historian wants to do research on this, you probably share your sources and so on and so forth. But if that doesn't happen, if you kind of collect some information and some facts and construct a fictionalized account, then that cannot be used in this greater historical discourse that can eventually at some point arrive at the truth. So isn't there some contradiction there? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So these are all very good questions. This kind of questions that I've been thinking about. Okay. First of all, I think what we're collecting are also often fictions. So in fact, with archaeology and with things like that, you know, we're actually collecting what, the further down we go in time, the further back we go, the more fictional it becomes, and the more we have to use our imagination, even as historians, in just being able to put together the facts. The second thing is, in the book, what I try to do, I mean, I thought a lot about this, because there's also an ethics of how you can write about real lives, that, you know, how much can you imagine? Is it right to imagine, you know, this person, for example, this other Leman that I was talking about, who has left no descendants and so on. Okay, I say I'm giving her dignity, to the dignity of memory, but actually, am I giving her the dignity of memory? Maybe she never wanted to be written about or spoken about, or, you know, so, you know, are we allowed to do anything we want to the dead who don't have anyone who can speak for them? So there's all these kind of ethical questions that I grapple with. And the way I thought about this was to say, whatever I can find and reconstruct from generic facts, I will do. And whatever I can't find, I will try to imagine, but with a sense of adhering as much as I can to whatever can be found. So I think, again, there, it's not a question of just completely discarding one and then replacing it with everything that is invented, which is why when I write about Salonika, for example, when I say my grandmother stopped in this cafe to have lunch, that cafe really was there at that point in that year. And it took me a lot of work to actually reconstruct which cafes were in Salonika in 1921, because as you can imagine, it's not, the city was burned twice, and it's you know, it was destroyed by the Nazis, went through war, and so to find actually just the historical facts about certain things. So there's a lot of discipline. You have to have a lot of discipline in how you're imagining, and also in how you're relating to history. So I wouldn't license, and I'm not advocating for license, and I don't do it in the book. Just, you know, if you can't just make it up, just make up everything. I'm saying if you can't find it and you've made the kind of best effort, then maybe you can fill the gap by imagining it. But as I say, it was a lot of work to try and find through the newspapers of the period, you know, where was this street, which has now changed names 3 times. And because it's a city, it's particularly interesting as a city because it has undergone Hellenization. And so it was completely different in the Ottoman Empire. And then it became a Greek city. And so the traces of the past were completely erased. So to find what the city was like in the Ottoman period is actually a hell of a lot of historical work. And I do not advocate that writers just write and, you know, invent the name of a cafe where you can find it and when you're claiming to write historical fiction. So I hope that sort of answers a little bit.
That at this time, I think it's high time for a question from an artist, an artistic researcher. So, Ben.
Yes.
What's it?
Yeah, I felt, thank you for being soft on artists. People, the world often isn't. Benjamin Gerdes, artist, dissident artist, practicing artist, and artistic researcher. I was curious, and maybe my question is not fully formed yet because I'm not a philosopher, so I'm trying to keep up.
That's why we need a question from an artistic researcher.
And so my references are more from the field of visual art than literature. And obviously then they're mediated or inflected through different materials, right? But I was curious, because it seems like when you talk about dignity and you're talking about the archive, there's very much a kind of relationship to the state and the various sort of citizenship structures that are enacted in this narrative. And so I started to think about the relationship of, I mean, art having this sort of dissident thing, but there's a kind of relationship to the state that's unspoken perhaps in your presentation, and you've kind of introduced propaganda several times as negative. But this line between imaginative art and propaganda is something I'd like to hear you talk more about. And then I put a long footnote underneath that, which is, so that's just sort of a prompt. But I guess I'm thinking also about contemporary practices where there's a kind of, let's say the sort of counter archive or the right to narrate or re-narrate or mediate between truth claims becomes the practice rather than a more imaginative or creative expression. But in that, like if we take something like forensic architecture as a really visible example, in that there is like right now it seems a strong impulse in a lot of artistic practices toward a kind of documentary or evidentiary function where the morality, I would understand it, is in some sort of relationship to a kind of truth claim being made or kind of counter truth, right? So I guess it seems like you're doing something different, and I was curious if you wanted to expand on one or two of those things.
I haven't quite understood the second, this very last bit.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate a little bit, just so I can kind of...
Yeah. So I'm just sort of thinking of various practices that are existing within art, right? And may involve some element of remediation or working with archival materials. But in the case of something like forensic architecture, if you're familiar, it very much is about reconstructing factual events in very, very advanced ways, and using them for various sort of legal and governmental procedures, right? So it sort of leaves art and is one model that is of interest to people because it sort of shows art has this capacity. But in doing that, it also is making sort of very, very strong evidentiary claims about what it's presenting, right? And so I think that as a contemporary impulse seems to be different than what you're arguing for.
Yeah.
So I was curious about that because it's evidence.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
sort of
great.
mediated differently, right? But
Okay.
it's, yeah.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, great. So I actually I really like your first question because I was thinking in my mind, I was kind of putting it provocatively, and I was thinking, yeah, when we like it, we call it moral education, and when we don't like it, we call it propaganda. And actually, in both cases, it's about some effort to shape persuasion and to condition the way people think and use, you know, the mechanisms at our disposal, whether art, literature, philosophy. But I think there is a difference in that moral education is about some moral ideal. And that's how I was thinking about Schiller and Kant and this, you know, there is a sense of a moral world, but there is not a sense in which the moral world is already the political world that we inhabit. And maybe that's the difference between moral education and propaganda. In propaganda, the moral world is the political world. And so morality is already in the institutions that we exist and we live under. And we're using these institutions and shaped by them in ways that that are not entirely intelligible to us, but we are somehow acting within them and reproducing the mechanisms of kind of consent creation and in a way that is, I think, different from moral education, because as I say, moral education is more critical and it's more about the future rather than about the present. And so that's where I would draw the line. But yes, completely, I'm completely aware of the fact that you have to then constantly retain that critical distance. If you lose the critical distance in the presence, that's where education becomes propaganda, actually. And maybe there's other things that you need to do, you know, to do with democracy and with institutions. And there is a more explicitly political part of the mission as well that doesn't just reduce to the role of artists. So that's a kind of separate conversation. But that's how I would distinguish. And maybe this kind of speaks to the other, and it is connected to the other question that you were raising, which is that I think in a lot of the way in which, in particular, liberal societies approach research about the past, it's exactly this idea that we inhabit this ideal liberal world, and now we just have to kind of settle accounts with the past as if our societies are not unjust. I don't know. I don't want to say in worse ways or better ways. So I'm not a consequentialist, actually. So it doesn't matter. You know, if it's unjust, it's unjust. But yeah, so there is a sense in which we approach this research about the past from the sense that we have a vantage point where we are morally superior. And I'm not so convinced that, and the argument that I'm making is that that's not the case, that, you know, every historical injustice is always connected to also a current, present, I call it structural injustice in my philosophical work, and kind of feeds into it. And so that's why you can never really have just settling accounts with the past and never really just resolving historical injustice, because every effort to deal with historical injustice is actually must be connected with the effort to deal with present injustice, and just as aware of the biases of the present as we would have been about the biases of the past.
Happy with that?
Yeah, I am. Thank you so much.
If
One-
you're happy, you're not allowed to ask again. If you're unhappy, you can ask it. I'm just
Yeah, I'm
joking.
okay.
Happy question.
What if I'm medium? I'm lukewarm. Yeah. I was also as an artist, I'm kind of like a formalist secretly. So like I was interested in what you're saying also. So it's not about a revision of the past, right? From a period from a sort of perspective of superiority. But I wonder if this kind of double voices, like the polyvocality in the text that you're writing, like if that is a kind of answer to this, we're not just going to replace the old master narrative with a new one, but we're actually going to have multiple registers at once.
Yeah. Yes, that was the idea. That was exactly the idea. And also because I think the challenges of writing different voices, the different voices have different moral challenges. So as I said, if I write about the present in the first person, it's me and I look at the world from my point of view. If I write in the third person about the past, about Saloniki in the 1920s, it's just not me. And so I have to kind of make an effort to construct this artificial other voice that has very different, I mean, maybe doesn't have very different moral commitments because it's still me, the writer, but it's trying to channel different commitments as well as the ones that are my concerns right now. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm so
We're
happy
running
now.
out of time, but before we leave Lea off the hook, I think we can squeeze in one more question, and that's the gentleman next to Ben.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Christian Raspal. I'm also in artistic research. And I actually had the same question as Ben, the second one about what is sometimes called the documentary turn in contemporary art, where sort of leaving, aiming for this evidentiary value that Ben just talked about. But I could place, I could put another question on the table, which is, which has more to do with genre and how to sort of position yourself within the field, or, you know, the style of writing and so on. And I'm thinking here of this debate in the wake of the publication of Saidiya Hartman's latest book, where that was sort of hailed and praised in some camps. And this, for those who don't know, it's what she calls a critical fabulation, speculative historiography. And in other camps, more maybe conventional historians, kind of attacked it for being too loose on the facts and so on. I'm thinking there that the problem to me seemed so much to do with sort of the claims made in terms of how that book was positioned and marketed. And she calls herself a cultural historian, not a historian, period. And I'm wondering, like, what genre do you consider your book to be within, and once it's released, where is it? Like, is it with an academic press? Is it, you know, because to me, I'm all for polyvocality and so on, but I think some of the confusion maybe and this polarized debate around Saidiya Hartman has to do with like the claims or or maybe some assumptions about the claims she made, which might or might not be true.
Yeah, this is also very good because it's actually in part connecting to a controversy that I had not anywhere else but in Albania about my first book, which was all about what is the genre of it. Is it, you know, autobiography? Is it autofiction? Is it history? Is it philosophy? Can you tell us? And I had no idea that there were these disputes when I started writing the book. So I came from philosophy, I was interested in literature, and I was trying to just blend them somehow in my writing just because I enjoyed doing it. But I hadn't really thought about the questions of the reception in a way in which, but the controversy around that in Albania made me much more aware when I started writing this project. And in many ways, this project makes it worse, actually, not better, because it's much more fictionalized than the previous one, which was an autobiography after all. So I did there, you know, to the best of my knowledge, reconstruct from memory, but still making an effort. Here, there are bits where I say, you know, there are this character is just invented, doesn't exist, or it's a blurring of characters, or and in fact the central character, you don't know if it's real or fictional, because as I say at the end, there was this other woman that was discovered. So and a historian friend, when I was describing the project, he thought this was horrible. He said, you have to say at the beginning, you can't leave it to the end. You can't let people come on a journey about your grandmother and then tell them maybe this wasn't my grandmother after all, and so this is going to be a disaster. But I don't know how much I need to worry about that. I mean, is that about the conventions through which we produce work? Or is it something that I need to do from a moral perspective? Because I'm not too worried about the conventional stuff. If people need to figure out where they put it on a bookshop, well, that's their job, not mine. I just have to write the book. And it's coming out with a trade publisher, with Penguin. Indeed, the same one. My publisher only does nonfiction. So, if people will want to argue, this is not fiction, is it fiction, not nonfiction, they will have a case to make there. The previous book was the same. In some cases, it was marketed in some countries. So Norway and I think Spain was sold as fiction, which was an autobiography, but it was sold as fiction. In other countries, it was sold as an autobiography, so nonfiction. And so that's where the debates kind of took different turns. I think of it as writing. And I don't think we need to worry too much about how we define the genre, as long as we're clear about how we're doing what we're doing and the reasons we have for doing it. And not that I will have a kind of methodological introduction or conclusion, because I think that would also not be very good. But, hopefully when you give talks, you can explain what the project is. And I think, I'm more open. If people have kind of real worries, real kind of ethical concerns about it, then I'd be really happy to hear more, because that's the bits that I'm more interested in. And the stuff about how they market and where they sell it and how they target the audience, that's for the publishers to worry about. I don't think an author needs to be bound by these things, because that's sort of a way of disciplining your thoughts, if you're trying to say, okay, what is the genre? Is it philosophy, or is it, I don't know, yeah.
On that note, join me in thank Lea for this, as always, wonderful and thought-provoking talk.
Thank you.
There are more seminars coming up next week, February 14. We have Lucas Meyer from University of Graz going to talk about supersession and compensation for historical injustice. So this kind of connects a little bit. And then we have on March 20, we have Claes Lernstedt, who is a professor of penal law. He's going to talk about Frankenstein's hairs. I don't know what that is. But there will be some seminar in between. We had a cancellation, but if you look at our homepage, there probably will show up some more seminars there. Very welcome.